Imagine the scene. A successful billionaire, used to dealing with numbers, business and power, walks into a nursing home with the simple intention of making a donation. Nothing more. Just another act of generosity, something routine for someone like him. But what Ricardo didn't know was that, the moment he stepped into that place, his life was about to change forever. As he walked through the silent corridors of the nursing home, a strange and unsettling gaze caught his attention. An elderly woman, with white hair and deep, intense eyes, was watching him with an expression that seemed to recognize him. Without saying a word, she began to cry, and with trembling hands she whispered, "My son, is it you?" Ricardo, startled, tried to make sense of what was happening. That woman, who seemed lost in her own world, was saying something impossible. He had always known he was adopted, and his biological mother, if she existed, could not have disappeared like this. But the look in the old woman's eyes, something about it he couldn't ignore. She seemed to be telling the truth, but how? Who could she possibly be? With a mix of disbelief and discomfort, Ricardo tried to push away the idea that she could really be his mother, yet her words echoed in his mind. "I couldn't protect you, but now you're here." Something about those words, the tone of pain and regret, struck a deep chord within him. He couldn't simply brush it off. He needed to understand what was happening, who this woman was, and most importantly, what she meant by those words. What seemed to be a simple case of mistaken identity would slowly turn into an unrelenting search for the truth. Ricardo had no idea, but what began as an innocent visit would become a dangerous and eye-opening journey. In his quest, he would uncover a much bigger plot, involving his own adoption, a conspiracy that threatened to destroy everything he knew, and secrets that had been carefully buried. But the issue wasn't just about finding his lost mother or understanding the mysteries of the past. It was about a game of power, lies, and manipulation, where the truth could cost him his life. And as Ricardo delved deeper into his mother's story, he began to realize that his own existence was far more connected to those shadows than he could have ever imagined. What would he do upon discovering that behind his adoption lay a story of courage and sacrifice that even he, with all his fortune, could not comprehend? How far would he be willing to go to uncover the secrets that his family, and even he himself, had tried to keep hidden for so long? And the biggest question of all, who was he really? The day was sunny when Ricardo, a renowned billionaire in the tech industry, entered the São João nursing home to deliver the promised donation. He walked through the polished wooden corridors, surrounded by the silence that only nursing homes seem to offer. The visit had been planned as a simple act of generosity, without any great expectations. As he approached the reception desk, a soft murmur caught his attention. An elderly woman with white hair and deep eyes was sitting in a wheelchair, watching him intently. Her gaze locked onto Ricardo's, and without saying a word, she began to cry. At first, Ricardo felt uncomfortable. He had never been at ease in emotional situations. However, something about that woman seemed to call to him in an inexplicable way. She extended her trembling hands and whispered, "My son, is it you?" Surprised, Ricardo looked around, hoping someone was mistaken. She seemed confused, perhaps a common memory lapse among the elderly. But the look in her eyes seemed genuine, and something within him began to question his perception. Who was this woman? Why was she calling him her son? "I am your son," Ricardo murmured, still in disbelief. The elderly woman with a sad smile repeated, "Yes, you are my son. I couldn't protect you, but now you're here." Her words seemed to carry a profound weight, as if this was more than just a simple misunderstanding. Not knowing how to react, Ricardo called for a nurse to approach. The nurse confirmed that the elderly woman, Dona Clara, had often displayed emotional outbursts, but there was no family history recorded for her. This in itself didn't make sense. He had never heard of a biological mother. "Dona Clara," he said, trying to maintain his composure, "I don't know who you think I am, but if you need help, I can offer support. But I'm a complete stranger to you." The elderly woman looked at him with sadness, as if he had said something deeply painful. As Ricardo thought about her words, a more experienced nurse approached and explained that Dona Clara was one of the oldest residents, known for her episodes of mental confusion, but there was no one in her history who matched the story she had told. Ricardo couldn't stop thinking about Dona Clara's words. Something told him she was telling the truth. Something was wrong, but he didn't know exactly what. He decided that, instead of simply ignoring the situation, he would investigate further. He needed to know more about her story. He asked the reception desk to search through old records that might explain the connection between him and Dona Clara. Perhaps there was more to this than just a coincidence. Something inside him had been awakened, and he couldn't simply walk away from the situation without understanding what was happening. He doesn't believe her but decides to investigate. As he left the nursing home, Ricardo couldn't get Dona Clara out of his head. His mind was full of questions, and he knew he couldn't simply ignore what had happened. But how could he believe that this woman was really his mother? He, who had always known about his adoption, had never doubted his origins. He headed to his office, trying to focus on the day's commitments, but something felt out of place. The encounter with Dona Clara lingered in his mind. What did she mean by, "I couldn't protect you"? How could someone disappear for so long and suddenly reappear? Ricardo began searching for more information. He asked his secretary to investigate any connection between the nursing home and his adoptive family. It didn't matter what it would take. He needed to understand if there was any truth to Dona Clara's words. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he was determined to uncover it. Hours passed as he sifted through old family records and forgotten stories. There was nothing to explain the connection between him and Dona Clara, but something inside him felt that the woman was telling the truth. Perhaps there was something hidden that he didn't yet know. The afternoon wore on, and his frustration grew. He knew he needed to act quickly. Dona Clara was there in the nursing home, waiting for answers that he might be able to provide. But he wasn't sure how to help her if he didn't even believe her words. Finally, Ricardo decided to return to the nursing home that evening. Perhaps there, he could find more clues or even an explanation for what was happening. He needed answers, and he knew the only way to get them was to confront Dona Clara once again. When he arrived at the nursing home, the atmosphere was calm, almost deserted. He made his way to the room where Dona Clara usually stayed, but upon entering, he found the woman sitting alone, her eyes fixed on an old photo she held in her hands. "I know you have doubts," Dona Clara said without looking at him. "But you have the right to know the truth. It's not my fault what happened. I was forced to leave you, my son." She looked at him, her eyes filled with pain and regret. "I didn't choose this. They made me." Ricardo felt a tightness in his chest. Her words, simple and painful, stirred something within him that he couldn't explain. He knew she was talking about something big, something deep, but he still didn't understand the context. Who were they? Why had his mother, if she was indeed his mother, been forced to abandon him? Without words, Ricardo sat down next to Dona Clara, determined to listen to what she had to say. He knew this conversation would change everything, but he still didn't realize just how deeply it would alter his life forever. He decides to search for old records. Ricardo couldn't stop thinking about Dona Clara's words. Something inside him told him she was telling the truth, but how could he prove it? He didn't know where to start. Determined to better understand the situation, he began asking questions to the nursing home staff. However, every answer seemed to be a smokescreen. The nurse, who seemed to know a lot, merely confirmed what he already knew. Dona Clara had been a resident there for many years, but there were no clear family records. The lack of information was disconcerting. Ricardo began to doubt himself, thinking that perhaps he was just getting carried away by a story that didn't make sense. He questioned other staff members, but the response was the same: "We don't know much about her past, sir. She arrived here many years ago and since then has never mentioned family." This only increased Ricardo's unease. How could something so important have been overlooked? Frustration grew. How could he know if Dona Clara was really his mother without more clues? He felt he needed to dig deeper. Ricardo decided that his next step would be to search for older records, perhaps in the city hall or local hospitals, that could provide a lead about his mother's disappearance. Back at his office, Ricardo called a private investigator. He knew he would need someone experienced to help him uncover more about the woman he now believed to be his mother. The investigator began searching through adoption records, missing persons cases, and other legal documents. Meanwhile, Ricardo visited a public archive in search of more information. He was determined to find out what really happened so many decades ago. Sleepless nights and growing desperation began to take their toll. He couldn't understand why his mother had been forced to disappear, nor what it meant for him. Finally, after a few days of research, the investigator brought both good and bad news. The good news was that there were records of his mother, Dona Clara, in hospitals and adoption authorities. The bad news was that the records were fragmented, and many details were missing, including the reason for her disappearance. Even so, Ricardo didn't give up. He knew the truth was there, just waiting to be uncovered. Deep down, he felt that Dona Clara hadn't lied. The connection he felt was real, and he was determined to find answers. His adoption led to their separation. Ricardo couldn't believe what he was uncovering. The documents the investigator brought to light revealed that, in a distant past, his mother had been the victim of a conspiracy. The story was even more complex than he had imagined. Dona Clara hadn't simply disappeared. She had been forced to vanish to protect her life and that of her son. He discovered that his mother had been a key witness in a corruption case involving some of the country's most powerful families. What seemed like a simple adoption in reality had roots in something much deeper. His adoption had not been a coincidence. His adoptive parents were, in some way, involved in the plot. Ricardo was horrified to learn that his life, what he had always considered a normal story, had been shaped by forces he could never have imagined. Dona Clara, it seemed, had been silenced by these powerful families to prevent her from speaking out about the case. She had been forced to disappear, leaving him behind, believing it was the only way to keep him safe. The revelation shocked Ricardo but also motivated him. He now knew that his mother had not been negligent, nor had she abandoned him willingly. She had been a victim of a conspiracy. This realization changed everything for him. He felt that the truth was more important than the life he had built up until that moment. He immediately contacted the investigator, asking him to follow the trail of those involved in the conspiracy. Ricardo had no idea where this would lead him, but he knew his mission now was to uncover the truth about what had happened to his mother and to understand the role his adoption played in the larger context. Over time, Ricardo began to delve deeper into his mother's story. He found documents indicating that she had been threatened and that her actions to protect her son had placed her in constant danger. The billionaire also learned that a vast network of influence and power was behind it all. As the discoveries piled up, Ricardo felt more anxious and determined. He knew the situation was becoming more dangerous than he had imagined, but he was willing to face any obstacle to save his mother and perhaps his own life. The billionaire now stood at a crossroads. His world of comfort and luxury was crumbling around him. He had never imagined that something as simple as a visit to a nursing home could reveal such deep and disturbing secrets. But despite everything, one thing was clear to him: there was no turning back. His mother's fate and his own story were intertwined in a way he could no longer ignore. Ricardo knew he was getting closer to a painful truth. He couldn't keep living with the doubt. It was time to confront his adoptive family. They knew more about his adoption than they had ever revealed, and he felt their silence was a way of covering up something much bigger. He arranged a meeting with his adoptive parents, the only people he had ever considered his real family. The atmosphere was tense from the very beginning. He questioned them about his adoption and what had really happened to his mother. But the answers he received were not what he expected. His adoptive parents, who had always been models of composure, now seemed visibly uncomfortable. His adoptive father, who always appeared so resolute, avoided looking Ricardo in the eye. "We don't know anything about this, son," he said, trying to remain calm, but his tone was unconvincing. Ricardo didn't believe him. He knew there was more to the story. He pressed them with more questions, but his adoptive mother interrupted, her expression filled with pain, pleading for him to leave the past in the past. "You don't need this," she said, almost begging. "Your life is good now. Why search for these answers?" At that moment, Ricardo realized the truth was much further away than he had imagined. His adoptive parents were hiding something, and it only made him more determined to uncover what had really happened. The tension escalated as Ricardo continued to press them. "Why was my mother forced to disappear? What did you know about it?" he asked with a firmness he had never shown before. His adoptive father sighed and for the first time, seemed to lose his composure. "There was a lot at stake back then, Ricardo," he began, but he was cut off by his adoptive mother, who shook her head in despair. Ricardo stepped back, realizing he wouldn't get any more answers from them. He felt a mix of anger and sadness. His adoptive parents, who had always been figures of authority and care, were now suspects in a larger scheme he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The search for the truth was becoming increasingly difficult and painful with each new step. Ricardo couldn't find peace. What was supposed to be a simple act of generosity had turned into a complex and agonizing dilemma. Dona Clara's words still echoed in his mind, creating a sense of urgency he couldn't shake. He knew that his mother, if she was indeed his mother, had been forced to disappear, but the questions kept piling up. Why had she been forced to leave? And who had the power to make that happen? The visit to the hospital was a last-ditch effort to find something concrete. The doors of the public archive opened to reveal shelves packed with folders and disorganized boxes. It was as if the answers were there but hidden, waiting to be unearthed. Ricardo combed through the documents, feeling a growing sense of frustration with each file he opened that yielded nothing useful. It was then, just as he was about to give up, that he found an old notebook of medical records. Inside, he saw a name that made his heart race: Osvaldo. He repeated the name under his breath, trying to make sense of everything. Among the medical notes, he found a curious detail. Dona Clara hadn't been admitted for ordinary reasons. She had made a series of allegations against a man named Osvaldo, a businessman who, according to the records, was involved in various financial and political scandals. Ricardo felt a knot in his throat. The connection was starting to make sense. He remembered the stories of corruption his father used to mention, of a world where the powerful controlled everything and everyone. Osvaldo wasn't just any name. He was the leader of a business empire, and his mother seemed to have tried to expose his crimes. But someone had silenced her. With the notebook in hand, Ricardo searched for more information about Osvaldo. He called an old family friend, someone who had worked with him during the early years of his career. The conversation was tense, and the man hesitated before speaking. "Osvaldo, he's more dangerous than you can imagine. Your mother back then was one of the few who knew about his schemes. They tried to silence her, Ricardo. And you're stirring up something big." Ricardo felt a weight in his chest. He was beginning to understand what his mother had faced. His life would never be the same, and he knew he had to dig deeper, to uncover everything that had happened. But the clues were starting to form a dangerous maze, and he had no idea where this path would lead him. With the discoveries he had made, Ricardo was more determined than ever. The search for answers had completely consumed him. He knew that meeting Osvaldo wouldn't be easy, but he had to face him. When he finally managed to arrange a meeting with the businessman, the chosen location couldn't have been more symbolic. A high-end office, filled with expensive objects and minimalist decor that radiated power and control. Osvaldo sat behind his desk, like a predator waiting for its prey. He looked at Ricardo with a cynical smile and said, "I knew you'd come, Ricardo. It couldn't be any other way. But you don't understand the gravity of the situation you're getting yourself into." Ricardo, his heart pounding in his chest, stared at him firmly. "I know what you did. I know you forced my mother to disappear. I know what you did to her to cover up the truth. You killed my mother, Osvaldo, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what happened." Osvaldo's reaction was cold, calculated. He stood up, approaching Ricardo with a disdainful look. "Do you really think you can bring down what we've built, Ricardo? Your mother was part of a story you don't understand. She knew too much. That's why she disappeared. You're stepping into a dangerous game. A game you're not equipped to play." Ricardo felt adrenaline surge through his body. He was in uncharted territory, facing a powerful and dangerous man. But he couldn't back down. He needed answers. He needed to understand what had really happened to his mother. "I'm going to expose everything. No matter what you do. The truth will come out." Osvaldo chuckled softly, as if Ricardo were just a child trying to understand the games of adults. "The truth. Your truth. You have no idea what you're up against. You'll regret ever starting this." Ricardo felt a chill run down his spine. He knew he was in danger, that much was clear. But Osvaldo's words only strengthened his resolve. He wouldn't turn back. He would go to the end, no matter the consequences. Ricardo was determined to continue his search for the truth, but the threats against him began to escalate. With each step he took, he felt himself getting closer to the heart of the conspiracy that had silenced his mother. And that put him in constant danger. Using the information he had gathered, Ricardo managed to infiltrate a secret meeting of powerful businessmen, where the most illicit dealings were discussed. Hidden in the shadows, he carried a concealed camera, recording every word. The footage he captured was damning. Osvaldo and other influential businessmen spoke openly about the crimes they had committed. Ricardo now had the evidence he needed to bring down this empire of corruption. But the tension was about to reach its peak. As Ricardo prepared to leave, one of the meeting's security guards noticed him. He tried to escape but wasn't fast enough. "You're not leaving here with that evidence," the guard said gravely, blocking his exit. Ricardo felt panic rising inside him. He knew that if he were caught, the consequences would be fatal. But he had no choice. The only way to ensure his mother's story was avenged was to expose the criminals, no matter what it took. He fought off the guard as best he could and managed to break free, fleeing to safety. As he ran through the dark city streets, the weight of the recordings in his backpack, he felt the shadows closing in around him. He was being hunted, but he was determined not to be silenced. His mission was just beginning. Ricardo was exhausted, but his determination had never been stronger. He knew time was running out, that he was being pursued, but the truth he carried needed to be heard by the world. He couldn't allow the powerful forces chasing him to silence his voice. With the recordings and documents in hand, he reached out to investigative journalists and people who could ensure the story was told correctly. The exposure of all the corruption, of all the crimes Osvaldo and his associates had committed, shook the foundations of the country. The scandal was enormous. Images of politicians and businessmen falling from grace were broadcast live across the world. Osvaldo's name was destroyed, and those involved with him were finally brought to justice. Ricardo knew his life would never be the same, but the burden he carried now was that of a hero. He had won. But the true victory came when he found his mother again. Dona Clara was in a specialized hospital, where she had been treated and cared for over the years. When she saw him, her expression changed. The light of recognition illuminated her face, and she smiled. She had been silenced, but now she was free. Ricardo, tears streaming down his face, knew he had finally fulfilled his mission. He had found the truth, faced those who had hidden it, and given his mother a voice that would never be forgotten. After a journey filled with secrets, betrayals, and revelations, Ricardo finally uncovered the truth he had been searching for, but the price was steep. He discovered that his life, the story he thought he knew, had been built on a web of lies and conspiracies woven by powerful families. His mother, Dona Clara, was not just a victim. She was a hero, forced to disappear to protect her son. But at the same time, he faced the painful reality that power and corruption could destroy lives and dreams, and that, often, the truth is a heavy burden to bear. In the end, Ricardo refused to be broken. He exposed the perpetrators, unearthed what had been buried, and finally gave his mother a voice, even if it was too late to change the past. The legacy of his mother, now revealed, would serve as a beacon for other stories of injustice hidden in the shadows to also come to light. And now, with the truth revealed, what will Ricardo's future hold? What other secrets are still waiting to be uncovered? This story may have come to an end, but the mysteries and life lessons it brought continue to live on.